Hi there! With Mechty's release on the global server, we have all currently existing Corrosion characters unlocked. In this video, I want to go over the trio of Klukai, Mechty and Peritya, discuss their relevant builds, and demonstrate their team synergy. Because I've covered Klukai and Mechty in their individual guides with plenty of detail, I'll be focusing more narrowly on each member's contribution to the team. Note that the gameplay in this guide will showcase boss battles using a V6 Klukai. This doesn't mean that the team synergy changes in a significant way with their upgrades, but rather that this is the best use case for the trio. With that out of the way, let's get to it. The Corrosion team is unified in their ability to dish out massive amounts of AoE damage. They will easily blast through normal map content, even at low investment. They also excel at applying debuffs. A lot of debuffs. Their main synergy stems from the fact that Klukai and Peritya complement each other well, and much more so now that Mechty entered the room. When Klukai uses her ultimate at V6, she deals 3 instances of AoE damage, each of which triggers a support action from Peritya. That way, the two bounce back and forth in their relentless pummeling of their unsuspecting target. Klukai is the main damage dealer of the trio and has 3 core aspects in her kit that benefit from having multiple instances of corrosion damage per turn, in particular at the start of battle. In AoE content, she is quite self-sufficient so long as enough enemies are grouped together, but for single target fights she appreciates some help. First, she has the buff Competitive Spirit, which stacks up to 12 times for a total of 60% permanent bonus damage. She gains a stack whenever she actively attacks or one of her allies deals corrosion damage. Similarly, her attacks apply her dot corrosive infusion to her targets, which can stack up to 15 times for a total damage multiplier of 180%. When a target with the dot receives corrosion damage from Klukai or her allies, an additional 2 stacks are applied. The effectiveness with which both of these mechanics are stacked determines Klukai's ramp-up speed. Particularly Competitive Spirit is accumulating rather slowly against single targets, as she gains by herself at most 2 stacks each turn, since her dots do not count towards stacking the buff. Then, Klukai gains 1 Confectance point whenever corrosion damage is dealt. Every 3 points lower her ultimate cooldown by 2 turns, and this effect occurs as she starts using her first ultimate. Since resetting her cooldown is crucial during boss battles, she requires help from her allies to regenerate 7 Confectance points each turn. Outside of her team, she can achieve this via her fixed key strong support, but with her corrosion buddies, she doesn't depend on support actions anymore. Therefore, Klukai can run all 3 of her damage type fixed keys for maximum output. Since Klukai's skills and dots deal AoE damage, they activate Peritya's support actions. At V0, Peritya can perform up to 6 support actions whenever a target receives AoE damage. Klukai's V6 ultimate exhausts all 6 of them, since her ultimate and her 2 dots are each counted as separate instances of AoE damage. That way, Klukai is somewhat of an enabler for Peritya, which works in favor of Klukai's mechanics, leading to synergy that goes both ways. This synergy is boosted significantly by Mechty's passive, which changes Peritya's support actions from physical to corrosion damage, as shown on the right. Due to this simple modification, Peritya dishes out in total 7 instances of corrosion damage each turn, helping Klukai stack up rapidly. As you can see, a double ultimate attack from Klukai without Mechty generates 4 stacks of her dot, whereas with Mechty on the field, the attack fully stacks her dot to its limit of 15. Moreover, she gained only 2 stacks of her buff Competitive Spirit from her own 2 active instances of corrosion damage, while she is at the stack limit of 12 on the right due to 6 additional instances of corrosion damage from Peritya. Of course, all these additional instances of corrosion damage also generate Confectance points for Klukai. On the right, this attack yielded 8 points for her. As you can see, her ultimate is still displaying 6 turns cooldown before we enter action. Once we do, we see the ultimate is fully reset, locked and loaded for the next turn, no additional fixed key required. Now that we've seen how the team enables Klukai, let's take a closer look at the most important parts in their kits. As you're surely most familiar with, Peritya's main gimmick are her support actions, which get triggered by any type of AoE damage from her allies, up to 6 times per turn. Note that Peritya gains 4 more support actions at V6, but you will require additional AoE skills to fully exhaust them, since Klukai triggers Peritya at most 7 times. On her own, Peritya's support actions deal physical damage, which is a major flaw in her kit. Rather than receiving a mod key to remedy the issue, the change was simply tacked onto Mechty's passive. Just by being on the field, Mechty changes all AoE type support attacks to corrosion damage, while also boosting their damage by 60%. Together with the Dream Guardian buff from her second skill, Mechty buffs Peritya's assists by 90%, up to 115% when she applies her debuff Toxin Inundation. As you can see from this example, All of this nearly doubles Petya's output. The 115% damage bonus plus the elemental weakness exploit add up to an effective damage increase of 84%. Even though this may seem like clear favoritism on Mechty's part, it's worth keeping in mind that Peritya desperately needed some help with her lackluster output. It would be unreasonable to expect Mechty to buff Klukai just as much. Aside from her support actions, Peritya will mostly use her ultimate, so long as she recharges 6 Confectance points each turn. It doesn't have any utility, but it's the ability with the highest damage multiplier in her kit. Occasionally, you may also make use of her first skill. It deals a little less damage, but comes with a buff removal. This is useful for turns in which Mechty uses her ultimate, in which case Peritya can take over buff cleansing duties. Additionally, Peritya can equip her fixed key Friendly Contact to increase the stability damage of the skill by 4, making it slightly more effective at breaking through stability shields. In practice, this means that you can choose between dealing more stability versus more skill damage. On the left you see that we dealt 7 stability damage to the boss using her as 1. On the right we dealt only 4. On the flip side, her ultimate dealt about 22% more damage. Bosses often have a damage reduction effect tied to their stability index, so being able to shred it faster may sometimes be preferable. That said, since Peritya's S1 has 2 turns cooldown, you should always be mindful when you need to have the buff removal available. Then, Peritya gains up to 30% bonus damage on her attacks when she has leftover movement, 10% for each tile, up to a maximum of 3 tiles. This effect applies to her skills and support actions, and activates also before she has concluded her action in a turn. In this example, we would like to move Peritya out of the mucus created by the boss. If we move Peritya to the full extent of her range before Klukai attacks, we'll lose the bonus damage from her passive. On the left you see Klukai's attack unfold before we reposition Peritya. On the right you see the attack after she has moved. With all the other buffs from Mechty going on at the same time, the 30% bonus from her passive equates to an effective increase of about 13%. When looking more closely at the action, you can see the passive activate as she launches her assist. Among her buffs, you see the 3 stacks of her passive, granting 10% damage bonus for each remaining tile of movement. This effect continuously activates for each of her actions and disappears right after. As shown, the stacks are gone the moment her attack concludes. Next, as a final note, all current MGs in the game have a trait which applies a random debuff when AoE damage is dealt. This of course includes Peritya's support actions. With 7 attacks from Peritya each turn, debuffs are flying left and right. The most important debuff you're looking for is called Fragility, which increases the target's received AoE damage by 10%. It's up to RNG whether you get it just when you need it, but it procs often enough to be relevant. The related debuff Fragile, which increases single target damage vulnerability by 10%, is also decent when you bring a sub DPS like Macchiato or Dian along. Since we're on the topic of weapons, let me also briefly address Peritya's options, given that I never got around to making a guide for her. Her signature weapon Optical Illusion has the highest base attack among all MGs and provides 25% crit rate. Depending on your attachment substats and stage buffs, this additional crit rate can be a bit awkward, as you can easily overcap your crit rate. For instance, the current Gunsmoke season buff grants all Corrosion type attacks 30% extra crit rate. Using Optical Illusion, you will likely overshoot 100% crit rate. Then, the weapons buff is geared towards AoE fights. When hitting at least 3 targets, the next skill damage is increased by 20%. With calibrations, this requirement is lowered to hitting only 2 targets, but never just 1, meaning the weapon effect does not activate in single target boss encounters. Even if it did activate, buffing Peritya's skill damage is less than ideal, since the majority of her output comes from her support actions. At max calibrations, the weapon is guaranteed to apply 2 debuffs with each hit, so at least that will eliminate all RNG when it comes to fishing for the fragility debuff. Next, for light spenders who buy the Battle Pass, the Mjolnir is a great option which yields more attack than Optical Illusion, while also providing an easy to achieve damage increase. So long as Peritya doesn't move, which she won't have to in most Gunsmoke battles, she gains a permanent damage bonus of 15%. Of course, this effect is not reason enough to abandon the free-to-play life, but if you are buying the Battle Pass anyway, this weapon is not a bad choice. If you don't have access to either of the SSR options, there are currently 2 SRMGs in the game. The Passionact boosts skill damage based on the number of targets hit. At max calibrations, the number is lowered to only 1 target for a damage bonus of 20%, meaning the effect will always activate. Similarly, the model ARM boosts skill damage by up to 20% at max calibrations, when more than 3 tiles of movement remain and the target is debuffed. Both of these weapons have effects aimed at boosting skill damage, so neither option is ideal. Since the model ARM has a slightly higher base attack, you may want to use that one. But if you have the Passionek at max calibrations, its effect is practically unconditional. Moving on, let me quickly touch upon the relevant parts in Mechty's kit that I haven't yet covered. Most importantly, she can create Toxic Mist, otherwise known as Swamp Tiles, which implants corrosion weakness in enemies in the area. This makes Mechty indispensable against bosses without innate corrosion weakness. She can create these tiles with her S1 while in turbo mode, and her S2 with the corresponding fixed key equipped. Then, as I've briefly mentioned before, she's able to apply the debuff Toxin Inundation, which increases corrosion damage taken by 25%. The debuff is applied with her attacks with the corresponding fixed key and also via her ultimate to the nearest target, meaning she can permanently maintain the debuff in single target fights. Keep in mind that with multiple targets on the field, you need to ensure the debuff hits the intended enemy. In this example, the boxes are targetable, so positioning Mechty like this will apply Toxin Inundation to the box instead of the boss. This is also indicated by the crosshair, so be sure to pay attention. When placed like this, you can verify that the crosshair is on the correct target. Of course, the same caveat applies to S2 for the generation of Toxic Mist. Make sure you are positioned so that the tiles are created where you want them to be. Finally, let me go over the fixed key builds of each member as part of the Corrosion team. I'll elaborate a bit more on each of Petya's key options since I haven't covered her before. First, Temporary System Maintenance grants her 1 Confectance point for every 10 points of stability damage she deals. When you have this key equipped, you will see a yellow indicator on Petya which tallies the total stability damage. Here, you see the boss receives 7 stability damage from her S1, which shows up as 7 stacks. Once it reaches 10, Petya restores 1 Confectance point and the counter resets. Note that it only tracks stability damage from Petya, so for example the 6 stability damage from Suomi doesn't count towards this effect. It also stops counting while the target is in stability break, so it only tallies the effective break and not the theoretical. Having this key equipped is most important when Klukai is not V6. Next, with Impromptu Cat and Mouse game, Petya receives a buff that grants 2 extra tiles of movement when she doesn't deplete the full extent of her movement range. The usefulness of this key is limited to stages where you need to move around, mostly due to her passive damage bonus when she has remaining movement at the end of her turn. The extra tiles from the buff are taken into consideration for her passive effect. Here, you see her with the buff, and when she moves toward the boss like this, the only remaining tiles of movement are the 2 from the buff. As she moves in for the attack, her passive triggers and grants her 20% bonus damage due to the movement buff. Note that the passive only accounts for the remaining tiles when she acts, even if the buff extends her movement range afterwards. Here, she executes her S1 with 1 tile remaining. This grants 10% bonus damage from her passive as expected. Then, the key triggers its effect and applies movement up to Petya. You may assume that with this, she has 1 plus 2 tiles of remaining movement, equating to 30% bonus damage. However, when her assist is triggered in the same turn, she still only receives the 10% bonus damage, meaning that the movement buff is not accounted for retroactively. Her other keys are quite straightforward. Automatic Repair Program grants her a debuff cleanse for herself if she didn't move at all. This can be useful in the occasional debuff heavy boss battle. One use case would be the 3rd Gunsmoke boss, which applies a 20% vulnerability debuff with its 2nd attack. Each time the debuff is cleansed, the affected ally gets a stacking damage buff. Lazy Resistance increases the damage of her 2nd skill against targets immune to displacement, which essentially means bosses. Since her S2 deals physical damage, it is her worst skill and should be avoided while you have other options. When paired with a V6 Klukai, Petya will recharge her Confectance Index each turn to repeatedly use her ultimate, with the occasional use of her S1 for extra stability damage or buff dispel. Her S2 would only be used as filler when you can't regenerate enough Confectance points. A brief respite is the generic 3 extra Confectance points at the start of battle. In summary, Petya doesn't really have any mandatory keys, as most of them only serve a specific purpose. Friendly Contact is generally a rather useful key, particularly against bosses who mostly benefit from extra damage reduction with intact stability shields. This adds a bit of extra utility to her S1, which otherwise would only be used for the buff dispel. A very generic setup would include the 2 keys for extra Confectance points. Temporary System Maintenance will be less relevant when Petya is paired with a V6 Klukai, as she can recharge her index just via her 6 assists, but it makes her turn order less strict. A brief respite only makes sense when you want to use Petya's ultimate on turn 1. Otherwise, it's better to replace it with a different option. Impromptu Cat and Mouse game is useful when Petya needs to move around, for instance in normal map content or against bosses where repositioning matters. The movement buff helps maintain the full 30% damage bonus from her passive. When you don't have access to a V6 Klukai, and temporary system maintenance is not enough to fully recharge your confectance points every turn, Lazy Resistance can be equipped, since you may have to use her as 2 as filler. Finally, Automatic Repair Program can be used against very specific bosses where debuff cleansing is relevant. Of course, mix and match as you see fit. Most of her keys will have use in some situations. Before moving on, let me also quickly recap the key setups for the other 2 members. As previously mentioned, Klukai can run all of her 3 damage key options as part of the trio, since she no longer relies on support actions to recharge confectance points. This only applies to a V6 Klukai, otherwise you will still need strong support. For single target fights, you bring one fell swoop. In multi-target situations, such as when a boss has multiple parts or continuously spawns adds, you can exchange it for Moment of Doom instead. Mechty will always bring Rest Thee Well for the 25% vulnerability debuff, and quickly so we can sleep for Toxic Mist. Even if the target is weak to Corrosion, the tiles apply Stability Assault and deal a bit of extra fixed damage. The third option depends on the boss. If you need to dispel buffs, which is fairly common, you bring Loser Spirit. Otherwise, the more generic option is Dream Fragment, which grants a random buff when using a basic attack. With that, we've covered the essentials of what you need to know, and it's time to explore the team in action. The gameplay is a recording from the current Gunsmoke against Deichgraf, a boss which most of us should be quite familiar with at this point. Next time it might be the Fortress Titan, but the logic should be much the same, though buff dispel won't be required then. This showcases a V6 Klukai using her signature weapon with Phase Strike. Her fixed keys are the triple damage setup with No Mercy, Limit Break and One Fell Swoop. Mechty is V0, using Golden Melody from Jeongju with Phase Strike. Her fixed keys are the usual suspects, to apply the vulnerability debuff and create Toxic Mist. The third slot goes to Loser Spirit for the buff dispel. Against a different boss without dispellable buffs, you can equip Dream Fragment instead. Peritya is also V0, using her signature weapon Optical Illusion with Phase Strike. She's running temporary system maintenance for a bit more flexibility with her confectance point management, and friendly contact for extra stability damage. The third slot doesn't matter, since we're not moving around, we also don't want to use her ultimate on turn 1, we avoid her S2, and we don't need debuff cleansing. For this battle, I'm using the 25% extra crit damage against targets with freeze debuffs, so we're bringing Suomi for her Avalanche. Mechty should always go before Klukai and Peritya, as everything besides her S2 will apply Toxin Inundation to the target, for a 25% corrosion damage increase. She starts her rotation by using her ultimate to switch into Turbo Mode, which grants multiple advantages for the next turns. Then Peritya uses her S1 for a bit of extra stability damage, 7 in total. This boss receives 2% damage reduction for each point of stability left, so we want to shred it as quickly as possible. As Klukai uses her ultimate for the first time, she applies the first stack of Corrosive Infusion. Her V6 ultimate triggers her 2 dots, each of which also trigger Peritya's assists. In total, this attack took off 18 points of stability from the boss. Due to the 3 instances of corrosion damage from Peritya, the dot is at 7 stacks after the first ultimate. Since this also recharges 3 confectance points for herself, she applies 3 stacks with the second use of her ultimate, followed by another round of assists from Peritya, maxing out Corrosive Infusion on turn 1. As we've explored before, this also stacks Klukai's buff Competitive Spirit to its limit and fully resets her ultimate cooldown. Turn 2 starts with Mechty using her second skill to create Toxic Mist and apply Dream Guardian to Peritya, boosting her support actions by another 30%. Since Edifice needs to be removed from the boss, Mechty has to use her basic attack for the dispel. If no buff needs to be taken care of, she can use her as 1, which deals more damage and also triggers Peritya's assist. When your Peritya is V6, every additional instance of AoE damage matters. Otherwise, this would simply be an opportunity to get Fragility a little sooner on the boss. Speaking of, as I use Peritya's ultimate, Fragility is applied to the boss. This is the best case scenario and a good reason to have Peritya make her move before Klukai. Now Klukai benefits with all her skills from the additional 10% AoE damage vulnerability, though effectively this gets quite diminished with all the other buffs and debuffs going on. Now, on a complete tangent, if you're frustrated with Deichgraf's slow movement as it attacks each ally one by one, the fault is on you for inconveniencing the guy. Instead, line up your team like this so that the boss can shoot at you without having to move a joint. This saves about 10 seconds each time. You're welcome. On turn 3, you can but don't have to use Mechty's S2, since its effects are still active. If you skip it here, you'll have enough confectance points on turn 5 to choose between attacking and her S2. Normally, attacking is preferable to apply Toxin Inundation, but in cases where the boss is not weak to corrosion, her S2 can be used to create Toxic Mist. Here, I'm using her basic attack again to dispel the boss, which also applies the debuff once more. Peritya doesn't have her S1 available, so we're using the ultimate as usual. Klukai is going last in the turn order so that the boss stability is reduced as much as possible. Otherwise, she's doing the same as every turn, so I'm speeding things up. On turn 4, the boss has one of its 2 big damage windows due to the 45% vulnerability and 50% defense reduction debuffs. We start by using Mechty's S2 to create Toxic Mist and rebuff Peritya. Then we have her S1 available for a decent amount of damage. Afterward, she switches back to patch mode, meaning she won't regenerate any confectance points for the next turn. If you skipped her S2 before, you'll have exactly enough confectance points to use her S2 on turn 5 if necessary. Then Peritya does her ultimate once more. As I'm using Klukai's ultimate, I'm wanting to make sure that the boss is currently affected by a stack of avalanche in order to activate the stage buff. Since the debuff resets once it reaches its 5th stack, you sometimes have to align the order of your actions such that the reset doesn't happen during Klukai's ultimate, since that would lead to a damage loss for her dots and Peritya's assists. On turn 5, Mechty is back in patch mode, so we have to decide whether we want to attack in order to apply Toxin Inundation or to use her S2 to create Toxic Mist and buff Peritya. If the boss is weak to Corrosion, attacking is preferable, otherwise her S2 should be favored. Remember to skip using her S2 on turn 3 or 4 if that is the case, as you'd otherwise be short on confectance points. Since we want to delay the stability break on turn 5 so that we don't have to break it on turn 7 when Deichgraf has its second major damage window, we need to move Suomi more than 6 tiles away from the boss. Otherwise, her passive keeps applying avalanche when allies use skills, which shreds 8 stability when it pops. Since we have a bit more wiggle room, we can also use Peritya's ultimate before we end our turn here. On turn 6, Mechty is back where we started. She can use her ultimate to apply Toxin Inundation and to switch back to turbo mode. Since that means we can't cleanse on this turn, you need to make sure Peritya's S1 is available, unless you have another source of buff removal. The rest of the turn is more of the same Klukai and Peritya shenanigans, so let's move along to turn 7. Mechty starts the round with another S2 plus S1 combo for maximum damage, followed by an ultimate from Peritya. Klukai goes in one more time, and I'm checking again to see if Avalanche didn't just hit its 5th stack. We did not manage to inflict the boss with fragility, but such is the way of RNG. And that's a wrap. You can see that Klukai is doing most of the work, but that is expected from a limited V6 character. Peritya is fulfilling her role as a sub-DPS with Mechty's help, while also dealing most of the stability damage on the team. To summarize, Mechty goes before Peritya and Klukai. Against bosses who are weak to Corrosion, Mechty's priority is to apply Toxin Inundation for 25% extra Corrosion damage. She uses her ultimate when available, uses her S2 to maintain 30% extra damage on Peritya, aligns the use of her S1 to turns in which the boss is vulnerable, and uses basics to dispel. If the boss is not weak to Corrosion, you may want to retain enough confectance points for turn 5 and prioritize the use of her S2 to create Toxic Mist instead. The effectiveness of this over-applying Toxin Inundation depends on whether the boss has a bigger damage window on this versus the next turn. Peritya will mostly want to go before Klukai to break stability or to benefit from the confectance points regenerated via her support actions. Her order is not set in stone though. If you bring a buffer like Xenia, you may sometimes delay Peritya's action so that she can still benefit from Blazing Assault for her support actions before the buff runs out. Here, the buff has 1 turn duration left. So Klukai goes first, triggering 6 assists from Peritya before she uses her ultimate, after which the buff expires. When you have her key Temporary System Maintenance equipped, she can move around in the turn order a bit more freely, as she doesn't solely rely on her support actions to recharge confectance points. Peritya mostly wants to spam her ultimate, since that is her highest damage multiplier, with the occasional use of her S1 for buff removal or stability break. Keep the cooldown of her S1 in mind, in particular when you have to dispel on turn 6 when Mechty's cleanse is unavailable. Avoid her S2 if possible. Klukai doesn't really need much of an explanation. Spam ult, profit. If your Klukai is not V6, the gameplay will be less streamlined. In particular, managing her and Peritya's confectance points will take more effort, since then you're only able to trigger 3 of Peritya's assists instead of all 6. When the boss has its stability up with a damage reduction effect, ensure that Klukai moves last. If you have a stage buff like this where your damage is boosted via freeze debuffs, ensure that they are applied and don't fall off during Klukai's attack, as can be the case with Avalanche. Similarly, if you're using a buffer like Xenia, check the buff durations so that it's always up during damage windows. And with that we've come to the end of this guide. which also concludes my recent dedication to the Corrosion element. There haven't been any new Corrosion characters ever since Mechty, nor have there been mod keys for this trio. I'm curious to see what the future brings, but for now it's time to shift our attention back to most likely the Burn team with Vector's approaching release, unless the developers allow us a breather with Jowie. Regardless, I hope to have you along for the ride. If you have any questions, want to share a feedback, or simply discuss Girls Frontline with the friendly bunch, I've created a Discord server. The link will be in the description below. In any case, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.